Portland International Airport. November 24, 1971. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving. The terminal smells like wet wool and cigarette smoke and the particular brand of American restlessness that existed before the age of anxiety made itself official. There are men in dark suits reading folded newspapers. There are flight attendants in sharp uniforms walking with practiced ease. There are families with children pulling at coat sleeves. Everything is ordinary. Everything is unremarkable. Everything is exactly as it should be. And yet, he already knew something no one else on that plane understood yet. A man approaches the Northwest Orient Airlines counter. He does not rush. He does not hesitate. He does not look over his shoulder. He buys a one-way ticket, Portland to Seattle, in cash. He gives his name as Dan Cooper. The ticket agent writes it down. She smiles. He does not quite smile back. He takes his boarding pass and he walks toward the gate with the unhurried pace of a man who has already decided that today is the day everything changes. Nobody remembers him clearly. That is the first strange thing. He was ordinary in the way that only very deliberate people are ordinary. A man so carefully constructed to be forgettable that every attempt to recall him produces a slightly different image. Some remember sunglasses. Some remember the dark clip-on tie. Some remember a businessman's briefcase. All of them remember the calm. An impossible, eerie, total calm. By the time they realized who he was already impossible to stop. Flight 305 is a Boeing 727. It is scheduled to be a short hop, 35 minutes in the air between Portland and Seattle. There are 36 passengers and a crew of 6. The aircraft is less than half full. It is the kind of flight nobody thinks twice about, a commuter run, a Thanksgiving travel connector, an afterthought in the logistical machinery of American aviation. The passengers settle into their seats with the dull ease of people who fly often enough that it has stopped feeling remarkable. He takes seat 18C, aisle seat, rear of the cabin. He orders a bourbon and soda. He pays with exact change. Somewhere above the Pacific Northwest, a man would disappear from history. Florence Schaffner is working the rear cabin when the man in seat 18C holds out a folded note. She is a flight attendant. She has worked this route many times. She assumes the note is what notes from passengers in this era sometimes are. A phone number, a flirtatious comment, something easily ignored or politely deflected. She doesn't open it immediately. She slips it into her pocket. The man looks at her without expression. And then, quietly, he says, "Mississippi. You'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." She unfolds the note. The handwriting is deliberate. The letters are careful. She reads the words and she feels the world tilt sideways on its axis, the ordinary Wednesday afternoon cracking open like ice over black water. I have a bomb. This is where history begins. Not in a courthouse. Not in a war. Not in a protest or a speech or a burning building. It begins in the rear cabin of a half-empty 727 at 30,000 feet. With a handwritten note and a man who is absolutely, terrifyingly calm. Florence Schaffner does what she is trained to do. She does not scream. She does not run. She walks to the cockpit with the careful, measured stride of a person who understands that panic is not an option. Not for her. Not now. Not at altitude. She tells the pilot, Captain William Scott, what the passenger in 18C has just told her. Captain Scott receives this information with the particular stillness of a man who has spent years training himself not to react before he can think. The aircraft is now somewhere between Portland and Seattle. The sky outside is the color of old pewter. Below, the Pacific Northwest spreads out in dark forest and silver river and the slow, brooding weight of mountains lost in cloud. It is beautiful down there. It is also completely, mercilessly isolated. Captain Scott contacts Seattle-Tacoma Airport and reports a hijacking in progress. Within minutes, the ground below becomes a different kind of world. FBI agents are notified. Local police are scrambled. Airport officials begin the delicate, nerve-shredding task of figuring out what exactly they are dealing with. What does this man want? Who is he? How real is the bomb? Nobody knows yet. Nobody knows anything. And in the rear of the cabin, the man in the dark suit orders another drink and waits with the patience of someone who has already run this scenario 100 times in his mind. But what nobody realized yet was, this was not a desperate act. This was not panic. This was not improvisation. Whatever was happening on Flight 305 had been planned. Carefully. Methodically. In a way that would confound investigators not for weeks or months, but for decades. Florence Schaffner returns to 18C. She asks him to prove he has a bomb. He opens the briefcase slightly, just enough. She sees what appear to be red cylinders, wires, a cylindrical battery. She does not look long enough to determine if it is real. She does not need to. The possibility alone is sufficient. This is one of the fundamental asymmetries of the hijacker's power. He does not need a real bomb to have a real bomb. He only needs the threat. He closes the briefcase. He tells her what he wants. $200,000 in unmarked, negotiable $20 bills. 4 parachutes, 2 primary, 2 reserve. A fuel truck waiting in Seattle. And a meal for the flight crew. He says it all without urgency. Without theatrics. He speaks in the tone of a man ordering from a menu he has already memorized. Not rude, not violent, not unstable. Simply decided. The terrifying thing about him is not rage. The terrifying thing is the complete absence of it. On the ground, Seattle-Tacoma Airport is transforming. Police cruisers ring the perimeter. FBI agents in civilian clothes take positions. Air traffic controllers clear the runway. The ransom demand moves up the chain of command with the velocity of something nobody has protocols for yet. Because in the fall of 1971, commercial aviation hijacking protocols are still being written in real time, on planes like this one, by people like Florence Schaffner and Captain Scott who are simply trying to keep everyone alive. Northwest Orient's president makes the call. They will pay. You do not negotiate with 36 hostages at 30,000 feet. You pay and you survive and you deal with the rest later. The money is assembled. In 1971, $200,000 is not a small sum to pull together on short notice in an airport city on a rainy November Wednesday. Investigators later note that the bills are photographed, each serial number recorded, before the cash is bundled and loaded. The parachutes are sourced from a local skydiving school. Everything is delivered under floodlights, in the rain, by people who have been awake for hours and who are beginning to understand that this situation does not fit any category they have trained for. The aircraft circles Seattle for 2 hours. 2 hours of cabin pressure and recycled air, and the kind of silence that only exists when everyone in an enclosed space is simultaneously pretending they are not terrified. The passengers do not yet know what is happening. Some of them assume a mechanical problem. Some of them sense something wrong in the quality of the crew's stillness. None of them know about the man in seat 18C. He sits quietly. He smokes. He orders another drink. He watches the darkening sky outside his window. This is where the story stops making sense. Because the man is calm in a way that is not the calm of recklessness or the calm of a person who doesn't understand what they've done. It is the calm of someone who has already made peace with all possible outcomes. And that is, perhaps, the most unnerving thing about D.B. Cooper. He did not seem afraid of dying. At approximately 5:45 p.m., the aircraft lands at Seattle-Tacoma. The passengers are released. They file off the plane in the strange, stunned half-days of people who don't yet know what they've walked out of. Some of them will spend the rest of their lives reconstructing this afternoon, searching their memories for the detail they must have missed. A look, a sound, a moment when everything could have gone differently. The crew remains aboard. Cooper remains aboard. He inspects the money. He inspects the parachutes. He makes no expression that anyone can later describe with certainty. He asks for the aircraft to fly toward Mexico City, though he specifies a particular altitude, no higher than 10,000 feet, and a particular airspeed, slower than the aircraft's normal cruise. The flight crew understands what this means even before the other shoe drops. He wants low and slow. He wants darkness and wilderness and the specific topography of the Pacific Northwest spreading out below. He wants, in other words, exactly what he is going to take. Investigators would spend decades trying to explain what happened next. Flight attendant Tina Mucklow stays in the rear of the cabin with Cooper for the next stretch of flight. She is the last person to spend extended time with him. She will describe him later, and she will describe him many times, to many people, for many years, as oddly courteous. As someone who seemed almost reluctant. As a man who told her, at one point, that she had been very good and that he had not wanted anyone to be hurt. She will describe his eyes. She will describe the way he handled the parachute, with the practiced ease of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. She will also describe the moment he told her to go to the cockpit and stay there. The crew receives an instrument alert. The rear staircase, a distinctive feature of the Boeing 727, a staircase that could be deployed in flight from the tail of the aircraft, has been activated. Captain Scott calls back. He gets no answer. The rear of the aircraft is silent. Whatever is happening back there, they are not in control of it. The time is approximately 8:13 p.m. The aircraft is somewhere over the Cascade Mountains. The temperature outside is below freezing. The storm has been building for hours. The forest below, if he can even see it through the clouds, is dark and impossibly dense, 1,000 shades of black descending into ravines and river canyons with no roads, no lights, no people within miles. He should not have survived what happened next. Think about what he is about to do. It is nighttime. It is raining. It is below freezing. He is somewhere above one of the most inhospitable stretches of wilderness in North America, wearing a business suit and a clip-on tie, carrying $200,000 in a bank bag. He has chosen a civilian parachute. He declined the military chute that was offered. Investigators later speculate about what this means. Whether he knew the difference. Whether he chose wrong. Whether he chose exactly right. He opens the staircase. And somewhere over the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, on a rainy November night in 1971, D.B. Cooper stepped out of the airplane and vanished into the storm. The aircraft crew does not know he has jumped until the instrument readings normalize. Captain Scott circles back. They search the darkness below. There is nothing, no signal, no fire, no trace. The Pacific Northwest simply absorbs him. The storm closes around the empty sky like water over a dropped stone. By the time military jets scramble to escort the aircraft to Reno, where it lands for the night, D.B. Cooper has already become a ghost. The FBI names the case NORJAC, Northwest Hijacking. It will remain the only unsolved commercial airline hijacking in American history. The investigation will eventually involve hundreds of agents, thousands of interviews, thousands of tips, a database of suspects that grows and never quite resolves. It will become, in the truest sense, a case that consumes the people who work it. But first, the country has to learn his name. And then, something even stranger happened. A reporter, working from sources with imperfect information, conflates the name on the ticket, Dan Cooper, with a local man named D.B. Cooper. The name has no connection to the actual hijacker. It is a mistake. An error in the fog of a breaking news night. But once the name goes out over the wires, it sticks with the tenacity of all good myths, and by morning the whole country is talking about D.B. Cooper, a man who does not exist, carrying a name that doesn't belong to him, who has somehow still managed to disappear with $200,000 and the complete inability of American law enforcement to explain how. The irony is almost too perfect. His legend begins with a case of mistaken identity. The manhunt begins in the wilderness below the flight path. The Army, the FBI, the National Guard, local search and rescue teams, all of them fan out into the Cascade Mountains, into the river valleys, into the dense Douglas fir and hemlock forests that cover the likely jump zone like a dark cathedral. They find nothing. No body. No parachute. No money. No footprints. No camp. No sign that any human being has recently moved through this wilderness at all. The forest, which has existed for thousands of years entirely indifferent to human drama, offers nothing. And something about that absence is more disturbing than a body would have been. Investigators would have preferred a body. A body closes cases. A body is an answer. The absence of a body is something else entirely. It is an invitation to speculation, to myth, to the particular kind of obsession that takes root when a story refuses to end properly. Except there was one problem. Several problems, actually. And they compound each other in ways that the FBI would spend the next 50 years trying to untangle. The jump zone, as reconstructed from the flight path and instrument data, covers an enormous swath of territory. Mountains, rivers, cliffs, and old-growth forests so dense that even a person who survived the jump perfectly could simply disappear inside it and never come out. And this is assuming he survived the jump. The conditions that night, freezing temperatures, storm winds, heavy rain, complete darkness, were, by any rational measure, unsurvivable for a man jumping in street clothes from 10,000 feet into unknown terrain. So who was he? What did he know? And why does every clue lead somewhere that doesn't quite resolve? The sketch. The FBI sketch of D.B. Cooper becomes, within days, one of the most reproduced images in American journalism. It shows a man of middle age, dark complexioned, with sharp features and a certain unremarkable quality that paradoxically makes him impossible to forget. Every law enforcement office in the country posts it. Every bartender and clerk and airline employee looks at it and thinks, I've seen someone who looks like this. Because they probably have. Because the sketch, like all composite sketches built from conflicting memories, captures something between a specific face and an archetypal one, the face of the man nobody quite remembers clearly. The tip lines flood. Within weeks, the FBI has hundreds of suspects. Within months, thousands. The agency works through them systematically, and systematically eliminates them. An alibi here. A fingerprint that doesn't match there. A timeline that falls apart under scrutiny. The case develops its own strange rhythm. A suspect emerges, looking convincing, and then unravels. Richard Floyd McCoy Jr. is one of the most compelling early suspects. In April 1972, just 5 months after the Cooper hijacking, McCoy conducts an almost identical operation on a United Airlines flight, parachuting out with $500,000. He is caught, convicted, and sentenced to 45 years. The FBI considers him a strong Cooper candidate. He had the parachuting skills. He had the military background. He had the nerve. His ex-wife would later insist publicly that he was Cooper. And then investigators look more closely at the composite sketch, at the physical description from the crew, at the timelines, and the certainty starts to erode. McCoy was younger than witnesses remembered. His facial structure didn't quite align. His widow's confidence, while dramatic and extensively covered by journalists, is not evidence. The FBI formally rules him out. The case file stays open. There will be more suspects. Many more. A forest ranger with relevant military experience. A convicted swindler who claimed on his deathbed to be Cooper. An Oregon man whose family, decades after his death, brings forward DNA evidence they believe matches material found on Cooper's tie, the clip-on tie he left behind on the aircraft, which investigators preserve as one of their only physical pieces of evidence. The DNA analysis is inconclusive. Everything, in this case, is inconclusive. Investigators overlooked something. That phrase will be repeated, in various forms, by every person who works the case, reads the case, or becomes obsessed with the case. And the reason it is repeated is because it keeps being true. Something is always being missed. Some detail that seemed minor at the time proves significant later. Some piece of evidence sits in a filing cabinet for a decade before anyone looks at it with fresh eyes. Consider the money. In 1980, 9 years after the hijacking, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram is digging in the sand along the bank of the Columbia River with his family. He is playing. It is an ordinary afternoon. And then his fingers close on something that crumbles, that falls apart in the wet sand. 3 packets of rotting $20 bills, the serial numbers still legible, still matching the ransom list from Flight 305. 290 bills. Roughly $5,800 of the $200,000. For a moment, a brief, bright, electric moment, investigators believe they have broken the case open. The location of the money might establish a trajectory. The condition of the money might establish a timeline. The pattern of how it deteriorated might tell them something about where Cooper went after the jump. And then the analysis begins. And the analysis produces results that don't make sense. The bills are badly degraded, but their deterioration pattern is unusual. They appear to have been deposited in the river in a bundle, not scattered, suggesting they may have traveled there from somewhere else, not necessarily from the jump zone. The rubber bands around the packets have decomposed, but in a way that doesn't align with 9 years of natural riverine weathering. Forensic experts argue about the hydrology. The FBI argues about the flight path. The money sits at the intersection of several competing theories, each of which is internally coherent and mutually exclusive. The money should never have ended up there. Or rather, the conditions of its discovery do not fully explain how it got there. And this is the most maddening quality of the Cooper case. Every new piece of evidence creates a new set of questions rather than resolving the old ones. And then another witness came forward. They always do. The Cooper case generates confessions at an extraordinary rate. Over the decades, at least a dozen men will claim to be D.B. Cooper, some on their deathbeds, some in tell-all interviews, some through relatives who only come forward after the supposed confessor has died and can no longer be questioned directly. A woman in Washington state claims her recently deceased husband told her he was Cooper just before he passed. A family in the Midwest produces a letter they say contains coded confessions. A Florida man gives a detailed account to a journalist and then dies before the FBI can interview him formally. Each confession is investigated. Each confession ultimately falls apart. The frustrating genius of the Cooper case is that it is nearly impossible to convincingly fake being D.B. Cooper, because the investigators know enough details about the real event to eliminate candidates, but not enough details to confirm any specific person as the hijacker. The authentic Cooper would know things no investigator has yet publicly confirmed. But every person who has come forward has, under scrutiny, revealed gaps, things they don't know, things they describe incorrectly, things that don't align with the crew's accounts. FBI Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach spends years on this case. He retires without resolving it. He writes a book about it. He gives interviews about it. He is, in the way that investigators sometimes become, inseparable from the case itself, defined partially by its refusal to close. He is not alone. The Cooper case, over 50 years, consumes more man-hours of federal investigation than many cases involving actual confirmed deaths, confirmed crimes, confirmed criminals. It becomes its own institutional entity, NORJAC, the file that stays open, the meeting no one closes. And yet, and this is the part the investigators sometimes find hardest to explain to people outside the case, there is something about working it that is addictive. Something about the problem itself. The case is simultaneously incomplete enough to sustain new theories and documented enough to eliminate most of them. It is, in investigative terms, a perfect puzzle, one with enough pieces to be almost solvable, forever. Amateur investigators fill the gap the FBI cannot. Across forums and message boards and YouTube channels and podcasts, communities of Cooper enthusiasts, and enthusiast is an inadequate word for the depth of some people's engagement, spend weekends and evenings and vacation days working the case. They map the flight path with GPS precision. They argue about wind speed and parachute drift and river hydrology. They compare witness descriptions pixel by pixel. They build spreadsheets of suspects and timelines and cross-reference them against historical records. Some of them are retired law enforcement. Some are aerospace engineers. Some are just people who found the story as teenagers and never let it go. There is something the investigators and enthusiasts don't always articulate directly, but that you can hear underneath everything they say. D.B. Cooper did something that most people only dream about. He stepped outside the normal architecture of American life, the job, the mortgage, the routine, the slow accumulation of ordinary days, and he did something enormous and audacious and completely, magnificently untrackable. He vanished. And this lands differently in the context of 1971. America in late 1971 is not a nation at ease with itself. The Vietnam War is grinding through its awful middle years, bleeding away young men and national confidence in equal measure. The previous year brought the Kent State shootings. Political scandal is metastasizing in Washington. Watergate is already in its early, unspoken stages. The economy is entering a difficult turn. The institutions that Americans were raised to trust, government, military, church, law, are beginning to develop visible cracks. Into this atmosphere, D.B. Cooper arrives. He is not political. He makes no demands beyond the personal. He does not claim a cause or wave a flag or leave a manifesto. He simply takes the money and disappears. And something about that purity of purpose, its complete self-interest, yes, but also its utter freedom from the structures that are failing everyone else, captures the American imagination in a way that a more ideological hijacker never would have. Within weeks of the hijacking, D.B. Cooper merchandise appears. T-shirts, bumper stickers, a fan club in Portland, bars named after him. He becomes, almost immediately, a folk hero, which is a very particular kind of American story. The story of the man who beats the system not by improving it or burning it down, but by simply walking away from it with the money while everyone watches. Wasn't he a criminal? Yes. And people knew that. They knew it and they admired him anyway, or maybe because of it, because admiring him was also a way of admitting how they felt about the institutions he'd outmaneuvered. The FBI, the airlines, the government, the whole heavy machinery of authority that in 1971 feels less like protection and more like pressure. He becomes, in time, something more than a criminal and something other than a hero. He becomes a myth. A projection screen for the things Americans couldn't quite say out loud in those years. The fantasy of escape. The dream of the clean getaway. The idea, seductive and probably false, but seductive, that a man sufficiently clever and sufficiently calm could simply disappear from his old life and emerge somewhere else, unburdened, free. That is a powerful idea. It is especially powerful when the old life feels like something worth escaping from. The suspects multiply. The theories branch and divide. And in the middle of all of it, the actual man at the center of the story remains opaque. A silhouette, a composite sketch, a set of behavioral details that are simultaneously specific and unanchored to any confirmed identity. He knew how to handle parachutes. Or he didn't. Some investigators believe he made a fatal error in his equipment choice. He had some knowledge of the Pacific Northwest terrain, or he had done enough research to simulate that knowledge. He may have had military experience. He may have had a background in aviation. He gave instructions to the cockpit crew using technical terminology that suggested familiarity with the aircraft. He knew things about Boeing 727 rear staircases that the general public did not know. And then he knew nothing else. Because after the staircase opened, he stopped leaving evidence. He stopped leaving anything at all. One of the flight attendants, interviewed decades later, will say something that stops the interviewer in the middle of a question. She says that what she remembers most is not the fear, though there was fear, enormous and cold and real. What she remembers most is how present he seemed. How entirely, unervingly present. He was not distracted. He was not checking watches or glancing at doors. He was simply there, in the moment, in a way that felt almost peaceful. She thinks about him still. She does not say this lightly. She thinks about the moment the staircase opened. She thinks about what he stepped into. And she says, very quietly, that she doesn't know if he survived. But she knows that when he stepped out of that aircraft, he had no regret on his face. In 2016, the FBI officially announces that it is suspending active investigation of the Norjack case. Not closing it, suspending it. The distinction is legal and bureaucratic, but also quietly philosophical. You close cases that are finished. You suspend cases that you have not given up on but can no longer actively resource. The distinction acknowledges something the investigators have known for years. The case may never be resolved in the traditional sense. There may never be an arrest. There may never be a confirmed name. There may never be a final, definitive answer. The file stays open. The clock keeps running. There is a theory that he died in the jump. That the combination of freezing temperatures, storm conditions, inadequate clothing, and the sheer physicality of a night parachute landing in dense Pacific Northwest wilderness simply killed him, and that his body and the money decomposed quietly in some river valley or old-growth forest over the subsequent years, leaving only the 3 packets of bills that Brian Ingram found in 1980, the money having traveled downstream from a crash site, perhaps, or an emergency cache that Cooper made. Before succumbing to the cold. There is a theory that he survived. That he was an experienced enough parachutist, or lucky enough, to land somewhere survivable, that he had planned an exit route, that somewhere a man either spent $200,000 very quietly over many years, or buried it, or lost it, or gave it away, and lived out the rest of his ordinary days in the particular way that people who have done extraordinary things sometimes do, never speaking of it, never flagging, simply continuing. There is a theory that the money found in 1980 does not represent the crash site, but rather Cooper's deliberate disposal of marked bills he could not spend, that he took the cash somewhere, identified the risk of the serial numbers, and discarded the visible portion before living on whatever untraceable remainder he managed to convert. And there is the theory that the case was never really about the money at all. That D.B. Cooper, whatever his real name was, wherever he came from, whatever his reasons, was making a statement that even he may not have been able to articulate. A statement about freedom, about disappearance, about the seductive and terrifying possibility that a person can simply choose to stop being the person the world has decided they are. That is perhaps the most haunting theory of all, because it does not require him to be alive. It does not require a clean getaway or a tropical beach or a quiet life under a new name. It only requires the moment itself, the rear staircase opening, the cold night air, the absolute darkness over the forests and rivers of the Pacific Northwest, and a man who decided that this moment, whatever came after it, was worth it. Not the FBI sketch. Not the ransom money. Not the composite witness accounts or the decades of suspects or the bureaucratic weight of the longest unsolved case in American aviation history. The image that stays is the staircase, the darkness below, the storm, and a man stepping off the edge of everything he had been into something that no one has ever been able to fully describe, because no one who was there to see it survived it, or if they did, they never said. Think about what it means that we still don't know. 50+ years. Hundreds of investigators. Thousands of tips. DNA analysis, forensic hydrology, ground-penetrating radar surveys, amateur sleuths with GPS and academic papers and decades of dedicated weekends. All of it, and still the answer is the same. We don't know. We don't know who he was. We don't know if he survived. We don't know where the money went or what happened in the wilderness that night, or whether some part of him is still out there in the Douglas fir, and the river mud, and the cold Pacific Northwest silence that has been keeping his secret, entirely without effort, for over half a century. Maybe D.B. Cooper died in the wilderness that night. Maybe he walked away. Or maybe the most unsettling part of the story, the part that keeps investigators up at night and keeps forums running and keeps people like you watching at whatever hour this finds you, is that after all these years, after all the effort and technology and obsession poured into this case, nobody can prove either one. The storm that swallowed him on November 24, 1971, has never fully cleared. The sketch stares back at you from the other side of 50 years. The face that belongs to no confirmed name. The man who chose a one-way ticket and meant it in every possible sense. The man who vanished, never really disappeared at all.